Hello, I'm Claire Poole and welcome to the Climate of Sport podcast, the show in which you get the inside track on all things sport and sustainability globally. Join me every week where I'll be chatting to a special guest about news, opinion and insights on how sport is moving to a more environmentally friendly future or taking action on climate change. Hi everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole. I am absolutely delighted this week to be joined by Stian Køhn Berget, who is Carbon and EAC Associate at Strive. Welcome to you, Stian.
Thank you very much for having me, Claire. And it's such a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to join you on your podcast.
Oh, it's so wonderful to have you. So first of all, before we hear all the great stuff you're doing at Strive and how you're going to be able to help sport on their journey towards net zero and in terms of their reducing their environmental impact, etc. I'd love to just hear a little bit about you in terms of your journey in sustainability and how you've sort of landed into this role.
Yeah, thank you. I currently work as a Carbon and EAC Associate in Strive. So we are based in the wonderful and beautiful capital of Spain in Madrid. As far as how I ended up in sustainability, I would say that I come from maybe a theoretical place of sustainability and its intersection with business strategy. And I think it all started during my studies where I wanted to take an approach towards more sustainability related topics. This was considerably noticed during my bachelor thesis, where I came across a paper from Michael Porter and Mark Kramer from early 2011. I think this has shifted a lot since this was a few years back ago. And the talks were mainly surrounding CSR. So keep in mind that this terminology is also changed a lot and is not used anymore. But at least in the paper, they go a bit in depth on the concept of what they coined creating shared value. So this is creating shared value between the business, sustainability, and local community, and to have kind of these topics at the core of the business. And of course, this has a lot of flaws and challenges in being a strategic tool. But it was very interesting for me in a high level of taking a deep dive into the current business environment then in Norway, when at the time it was a lot of talks about the green shift, how to shift from a very fossil-based economy, which is still occurring, but at least it was, I would more say, in the early stages of where this became a more thought. And then I was also building more on this during my master thesis, but even more in a theoretical way, where I focused more on the activity-based view of business and researching how changing the activities in the firm affects the business model and its implications to capture value and also capture this value in a circular economy setting. So after I finished this Master of Science in Business, I started in Strive and I've been there for over a year now, which is not a lot compared to the other guests that you have on this podcast. But I feel like at least I have a very theoretical viewpoint coming from more researching and focusing my studies on this. And it's now very rewarding to actually transform this knowledge into practice.
Incredible. Well, it's wonderful to hear about your journey into this. And I think already you've hit on something really important in terms of putting sustainability at the heart of business in terms of what we're trying to do when it comes to sport as well, in terms of really having sustainability factor through all parts of the sports business. So already we're hitting on great stuff. And I think just to set the scene for people as well who are listening, the majority of guests on our podcast are rights holders, athletes, and people coming from within sport. But for this series of the Climate of Sport podcast in the run-up to our summit, which will take place in October 2022. We're inviting guests on from solution provider organizations like Strive, who we know sport can't do this alone. If I hear from one more sports organization that they don't have the expertise internally and then they're not sure and they really need this external support to get on this path towards reducing their environmental impact, understanding that impact, and then tackling that going forward. So we're delighted to have you join us to be able to give sports organisations, rights holders, etc., some more information to help them on their journey. So if they're at the start of this journey in terms of reducing their environmental impact, we're going to dig into where do they start and what is scope 3 and how are we going to go about setting boundaries, etc. So we're going to get into that. But first of of all, why don't you tell us a little bit about Strive as an organisation so that they can understand where you sit within this landscape?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Strive is, to simply put it, we are the climate action division or arm of Vertis Environmental Finance Group, which is one of the pioneers in the carbon markets. So Vertis was founded in 1998 and is today a market leader in what is called the EU Emission Trading Scheme, which is a regulated market established in 2005 by the EU to force companies of selected sectors to act on climate action. So last year, Vertis launched Strive. And in short, what we do at Strive is that we help companies integrate climate action by helping them define their sustainability journey. So we provide a full service within carbon management services and other sustainability related services. Mm-hmm. So this includes all from mapping out and quantifying the emissions a company has as a vital step, as you can't reduce nor act on what you can't measure. And then we help them implement reduction and decarbonization strategies to reduce these emissions. Furthermore, Strive helps with tailor-made services within environmental commodities, such as energy attribute certificates, or also referred to as EACs, mm-hmm. as well as high-quality carbon offsets. So kind of to set the also context of the situation, as we know, there is an ever-increasing urgent need for climate action, and seen, for instance, by the latest IPCC report. And according to it, without immediate and deep emission reductions and cuts across all sectors, so it's very important to have all sectors included in this work, mm-hmm. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is beyond reach. And as we also know, in order to secure a livable future, we need to keep this level at least below 2 degrees Celsius. So as such, yeah, there is an urgent need for a radical and faster transition in all sectors. This is where we come in, helping companies integrate what we call 4 pillars of climate action, which goes for, first you measure your emissions, then you have to reduce them. Then you have to offset what you cannot reduce, and as well as we help them communicate these sustainability efforts. So companies, they need to first know their emission and have established system for tracking and monitoring these emissions, such as the water or electricity consumption, fuel consumption, and so on. And then also set up a plan to reduce and abate as much as they can by, for example, energy efficiency measures or alternative fuels. However, also in doing this, companies will be left with what we can call unavoidable or hard to abate emissions. And they can be of technological or financial and unattainable to reduce and address at the moment. In order then to address these emissions here and now, companies must also channel financing into projects that verifiably remove, reduce, or avoid emissions anywhere on the planet, such as planting trees in the Amazon and preserving the biodiversity there, helping communities in Myanmar, and so on. And all of these projects are very much aligned with Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN. Our job here is to find the appropriate projects for our clients. So kind of to provide a short example for this, if a company is using a lot of timber or wood as an input factor in their production, they might be more interested in supporting a project focusing on preservation of forest and its biodiversity somewhere else in order to balance out their unavoidable emissions that they simply, there's not a viable tool to address these emissions here and now, but you still would like to address this.
That's a huge amount of information, so I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you some questions about this. You're so knowledgeable, and there's so much great stuff in there, and I think we'll just break that down a little bit. First of all, I just want to reflect on, as you said, the need for urgent climate action, just to start off, because I think we've all experienced globally the wildfires, the heat waves, the flooding, the drought, and this is what we're seeing in a 1.1 degree world. So when we think about 1.5 is what we're aiming for, we're online for a 2 degree world. When you think about what we're experiencing and the impact already being have on sport in a 1.1 degree world, it really brings home how important this is, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And how unfair kind of these consequences are doing as well. It's usually impacting poorer areas way worse than kind of the ones actually standing for the majority of the emissions as well.
Absolutely. And already we're seeing, at the time of recording last week in France, we've seen activists putting cement in holes in golf courses because there's not enough water in France and there's a ban in certain areas, but golf is exempt from that ban to keep the greens green. And already in a 1.1 degree world where we're seeing these impacts of constraints on water, we're seeing people pushing back against that for sport to continue to have a license to operate. And I think we're only going to see more of that. And again, it just underlines how important this is, because even in a 1.5 degree world, how exponential are these impacts going to be on sport?
Yeah, no, definitely. And also the terms of climate adapting to this, and especially for grassroots sports organizations such as here. I'm currently now in Oslo in Norway, and as everywhere else in Europe, it has also been very dry here. But this Monday, suddenly it started raining a lot, which created floods. And then for sports organizations that here, they tend to use artificial grass for football fields. So it was one which has happened earlier as well, but the whole field was flooded again. And they use, instead of granulate, they use corks.
Right.
So this started flooding into the locker rooms and everything. And this is already a financial stressed organization. So they can't afford to actually clean up this field. And it's that's just one out of many grassroots organizations as well that is impacted by this.
Absolutely. So we're already seeing these impacts, and again, just underlying the urgent need for climate action. So you gave an incredible overview, but let's just drill into it a little bit in terms of if sports organisations are listening to this and they're thinking, we really are at the start of this journey. The first step you mentioned there was measure. So again, if we think about organisations, sports organisations that maybe don't have a huge amount of resource or they haven't got the expertise internally, where would you recommend people start when they think about, I need to measure? What sort of things do they need to be thinking about measuring?
There's a lot of coinciding with other sectors as well, and especially smaller nations such as here in the Nordics, where it is a challenging work in all sectors, and especially when you have limited resources and human resources. Maybe you have one person that is in a part-time position on focusing on sustainability, but they also have other work that they need to tend to. So, I mean, it's because of this, it's also challenging to do the necessary steps with first starting to actually mapping out your emissions. And where do you even begin if you don't have the expertise? And there, I feel like the way you are very on the forefront here and guiding and helping these organizations to where do I actually start and how do I collect and how to monitor the data, as this is a very difficult area. And we also see this with smaller companies, that it's there's a barrier to kind of start working with mapping out your emissions. But once you have managed to set up some framework for this, you have some internal tools that you can use, then it will become more easier over time as you can go back and you have already established some practices. But you just have to start somewhere, even though it's tiny. You just have to set up and especially start on mapping out your emissions and the GHG protocol with scope 1 and 2. Maybe those are easier to both map out and monitor over the years, and it's easier to obtain consistent data. But again, you have to start at one point.
Absolutely. Even if you're not a climate, you don't have to be a climate scientist to be able to look at your energy bill and see how much energy you're using every quarter or every year and where that energy comes from. For sports organizations, if staff are using cars to travel to work, or if teams are being sent to a game on a coach, again, there'll be financial records of expenses, miles traveled. It's quite easy to find out what fuel's been used, etc. So I think in terms of the measurement, as you said, it's hard to know where to start and where people don't feel like an expert. But I think even if it's not perfect, our recommendation is always use the data that you've got, mostly probably financial data in the first instance, which you can then build on. But at least it's a start of wrapping your head around, where actually are we?
Definitely. And then, with the quality of the data, that might take some time to know which exact emissions factor you should use, but at least to just start mapping out your energy consumption, water consumption. And this is easier than before we start with the whole scope 3, which is a challenge everywhere, but especially in the sports industry.
Absolutely. So we've done the measure bit. Say we've got some data on that. The second element obviously is reduce, which is quite self-explanatory. We probably don't need to delve into that too much, but essentially, whatever your situation is, looking at moving on to more sustainable sources. We always say work with partners in terms of trying to reduce as well. Work with the relationships you've got to see how you can reduce your impact. So as far as possible, you want a good strategy around sustainability. There has to be that reduction. We can't just say we are doing everything well if we continue business as usual and then just offset. So I don't know if you've got anything to add in there, Stian, but for me, the reduction element is one of the most important ones before we start looking at
definitely. You need to reduce and abate as much as you can possibly do, but it's a very crucial step to map this out and also set up a plan, because when you map out your emissions, you also can see or get a better overview of where you can do strategic action.
Absolutely. So in terms of we're reducing as far as possible. And then the third step obviously is offsetting unavoidable emissions. Now, for a lot of sports organisations, the unavoidable emissions come from scope 3 in terms of fan travel or different elements that sit around that. So can you share, even as it applies to other industries in terms of scope 3? Let's not say by any stretch of the imagination we've got the answers here. It's a very complex area. But how can we start to think about scope 3 in a way that makes sense when it comes to offsetting?
So I mean, you have to communicate with your partners, with your suppliers. And here I also feel like the sports industry might be a bit on its own, that they can also choose to align their partners with their own strategy kind of in the core. And I think that's the easiest kind of advice to give, is when you have to renew these partnerships or sponsorships, or that you actually find a partner or sponsor that aligns your values. And you also see an increase demand from companies setting not regulations, but they're setting frameworks for what their partners should be doing, and that they also should be transparent in their sustainability work. They should also follow the same pillars. So I mean that's where you have a very unique position in the sports industry, with especially in the professional sports, with the bigger organizations there, with the magnitude that they can deliver by choosing partners and sponsors.
Absolutely. So that's brilliant in terms of the as you said, aligning with that and trying to minimize the scope 3. But is there anything you can add about this idea of setting boundaries around scope 3, or the process that you might go through when you think about what scope 3 should include and the boundaries that sit around that?
So I mean, in the sports industry, it's very difficult, challenging, especially with scope 3, and you have fans traveling here, and whether this should be within your scope 3. And I think here it's you have to be transparent in the way you're setting your boundaries here, and what you're actually including, which categories you are including, and how to adapt this to more of a sports setting, as it is differing, but also other sectors as well differs from each other. So I mean, utilize network externalities across also sectors could be beneficial to be aware of where you can set these boundaries.
Absolutely. And I think we've seen that in terms of sport organisations that have released information about their carbon footprint. Some have included fan travel in that, and others haven't. But I think that the point that you make about transparency is absolutely key. As long as whether you're saying you're net zero or carbon neutral, or however that manifests in terms of your reduction, there has to be that transparency there.
Yeah, and I think that's the key to everything, to be transparent in your work, and what you are actually measuring and what you are including, and publish this.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last element, just to finish off that, actually is the communication part, which you mentioned. And I think we speak about that element a lot as well, because we know that sport as a sector is not the highest emitting on the planet in comparison to other industries, etc. But what sport has that a lot of other B2B industries don't have is this connection with citizens and fans and people globally who they can perhaps influence to change their behaviours, etc. So again, give us a bit of insight from your side, perhaps learnings from other sectors of how important that communication element is.
Yeah, so especially in the sports sector, it is, given the kind of nature of brand recognition and reputational risk in this sector, this might provide also fear of committing to actual ambitious climate action targets, which I would say is a huge challenge in the sports sector. That maybe your actions might have a large impact on the brand, which might already be under a lot of scrutiny on its efforts. And the way that you have your fans here, which is very different from an average consumer, it's not the same as a consumer. And then the fear of being hypocritical in asking those to actually change their behavior without also providing the necessary tools for these to change their behavior. For instance, in traveling to games in a more environmentally friendly way, but you don't have the necessary tools to make this a possible option.
Yes, but within that, I would fly the flag for. We see, that fear of hypocrisy or the concern around it shouldn't paralyze people, should it? Because we all have challenges around these, but we can't say, well, it's too hard, so we're not going to do it.
Yeah, and I feel like that's also maybe one of the challenges in sports industry as well, is that you have this idea that you need to have a perfect and bulletproof plan before you commit to any ambitious climate action targets. And I feel like this also, prevent any work being done at all, because you wait for this long time. And there I would emphasize how great the UNFCCC is to actually provide a platform to committing and using this as a necessary push to also implement climate action into the whole organization. And at least the start of it into the organization. And the sector is also heavily known for having athletes and teams with other ambitious targets on the sports ground. And why not also bring this into all other areas of working, as the risk of not doing any action at all might be larger and larger as the time passes by now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's it. We have to use the beneficial elements of our industry to be able to make these commitments. And then I think, as we've touched on, be transparent in the efforts, be humble on the journey, but still continue to press on with it. And I think that's incredibly important to underline as well. So from your perspective, in terms of a sort of macro view of the industry, I've touched on a few of the challenges and the barriers we're facing, but what do you think we need to see next?
Yeah, no, so definitely I will first emphasize that I feel like a lot has changed over the last 5 to 10 years. Much of your work and how you have been working with this, and even so just the last 2 years. But, also the world has changed more rapid as well. You have more and more companies setting ambitious targets with science-based targets. But in the sports sector now, at least I'm noticing a lot of organizations are now seeking or wishing to build up a sustainability team within their organization. And this seems to be an increasing number all over the sector, where you also have these green sports networks multiplying, and as well as I mentioned with the UNFCCC. So I feel like there has been a lot of progress here in the short time, and it is still progressing. As this is also an impossible task to do it alone. It is necessary with the networks that you are providing. I think we will also see more and more of the need to have clusters and networks to exchange ideas and cooperation in order to meet this critical decade we're in. And then both within the sector, but also from insights from out the sector. But yeah, we also see a lot of athletes now taking more and more action and, provide their arena, or they go into the influence that sports can have with its position, changing behavioral attitudes, which I think we see more and more of. And one example of this is my countryman, Morten Thorsby, who I also played football with growing up. Yeah. And he has founded now an organization aiming on improving both the focus and actions of football in relation to sustainability. And as such, to kind of signal this and also how he works with it, he chose to play with the number 2 on his back some years ago, signaling the Paris Agreement target of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. And I think kind of actions like this might seem small for many, but I think it can have serendipitous consequences on changing behavioral attitudes of the people actually watching, and it can create talks and there I feel like football and sports in general is in a unique position where it can impact behavioral change more unconsciously for the viewer or for the fan. And also another thing that we're seeing more of, and what I also assume we will see more of, is within regulations and authorities to put forth stricter rules on sustainability that can be applicable in the sport. And we see it now with the DFL that announced that they're setting binding sustainability requirements in the licensing agreement for Bundesliga and the second Bundesliga. And I think this is something we will see more of, and also what we need to see more of the organization bodies to actually put forth sustainability requirements in licensing agreements for teams to actually report on this.
Great points there. And I think there's so many now, as you mentioned, in terms of the athlete voice, so many organisations popping up, eco-athletes, athletes of the world, front runners, etc., that are doing incredible things in that space. And you're right, in some instances, it may feel like small actions, but the ripple effect of those we know is massive. So just a couple of questions to finish off. You obviously work with so many different industries. When you think about sustainability in the context of sport, what's your hope for the future in terms of the role that sport could play?
Yeah, so I hope to see the continuous development that is happening, and you see more and more participants in the UNFCCC. And I really feel it is changing. But, you have, on the other hand, the fear of, given this financial situation of a lot of these organizations, that you have the reputational risk or the risk of sport washing. And I really hope that sports organizations might use their power instead to have an alignment, as I touched upon a bit earlier, with its sponsor, with its owners. Yeah, that we see a lot of more knowledge sharing, as it is a place you can't go it alone. And also to just note on that, you also see new developments such as the Scope F for the fan base now. And
yes.
We need more of those ideas, and I really think this also will come up.
New innovations, new concepts, that incredibly important as well, to keep pushing the envelope on what more sport can do and how we can measure and amplify the reach of sport. So I think that's a great place to finish. Strive obviously are coming to this Sport Positive Summit in collaboration with UNFCCC and the IOC in October 2022 to talk about working credibly with offsets, which is a question that we hear all the time. So just give us a little insight for those who are attending the summit of what they're going to learn in that breakout.
Yeah, so without saying too much, I hope that people can expect to, find out when is it relevant to utilize and implement this tool that is one out of many tools in the toolbox. Kind of what is the key thoughts that you have to think about to have a robust offsetting strategy, what pitfalls you should avoid, and how you kind of can work with this tool in a very credible way to preserve high integrity, for instance, in the claims that you wish to move forward with. I think we also want to address a bit of the communication bit, how to address this, as it could be especially difficult in the sports sector with the marketing bit and also the sustainability work. So we will try to provide an overview of what are offsets and what are credible offsets, what make them credible, and how can you kind of get a better comprehension of this and address the uncertainty that many actors have on offsets.
Incredible. Well, that's something to look forward to. And I know it's something that a lot of people have questions about and are concerned about, in terms of, we know at this stage there is unavoidable emissions in sport and we have to navigate that in some way. So I think that's going to be really beneficial for people to hear about. But it's been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast, Stian, and thank you so much for taking the time, and very much looking forward to seeing you and the team at Sport Positive Summit.
Thank you, Claire. I'm very much looking forward to that as well. And it has been such a pleasure to be here on your podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Climate of Sport podcast. Please like and subscribe and get in touch if you want to share information about the work that you're doing, if you want to appear as a guest or you want to recommend guests, or you just have ideas of conversations you'd like us to have. You can get in touch by emailing info@sportpositivesummit.com.